Struggling to grind those final levels in the performance pass? Is all the Season 4 discourse getting you down? Well, then let me distract you with some terrible ideas. I don't know why it's already on the unstable one. That is not intentional, even in the slightest. Look, I mean, I enjoy doing these videos. I just think this one's a little bit of a weird one, and I'm not going to explain any of the weird shit that I normally run through every time I do these. I'm just going to dive right into it. Plasma Burster Grenade Overclocks. What do they look like? I've got a clean one here. It's called Burst Regulator. Apparently you can cook the Plasma Burster, and the longer you cook it for, the greater the distance between bursts will be, and vice versa. So, people who don't know how the Plasma Burster works, I actually think it's up there in terms of the grenades in the game, only because it's a really cool combination of a lot of raw power, but also genuine intrigue and complex mechanics. Because, obviously, you know that it bursts in four bursts, four separate bursts in a line, kind of. You've probably seen it travel down walls. You know that if you throw it in the air, it probably goes down an incline, something like that. You've probably seen these different things. You might not know that, well, you might have guessed. Trajectory and momentum plays a huge role in how the Plasma Burster bursts. Momentum is a big one that makes it interesting to me. The distance between the bursts will actually be affected by how fast you're moving, basically. So, for example, if you're sprinting, you're dashing forwards, they're in midair, the burst might be something like this. But if you were to be moving, just walking backwards and you throw it, the burst might be something like this. Much, much closer together. I like the idea of having an overclock that gives you more direct control over that. And it would be exponential. It would be additive to those effects as well. So, for example, if you throw it instantaneously, therefore at the shortest amount of cook time possible, while walking backwards, it might be something like this. Really tightly packed, which results in a lot of dense damage. Can kill a lot of densely packed targets and do a lot more single target damage. Or, when you're sprinting, and you use this, and you've been cooking it for a while, you've been cooking it right up to the very end, and you sprint and then throw it forward, the burst might be something like this, really far, but extremely sparse, and the usefulness of that is somewhat debatable. But I like the idea. I like the idea specifically because it's an interesting way of using the cook mechanic. I really do want to see that come back. I think a lot of grenades could just do with being added to them in general. I'd love to be able to burst. I'd love to be able to cook the incendiary grenade and cluster grenade on gunner, especially the cluster grenade. That would make the cluster grenade a lot better, actually. And I wish that you could do the same thing with maybe the neurotoxin grenade, even. But really, it becomes interesting when you apply it to something that you wouldn't expect cooking to necessarily work for. And I think the Plasma Burster is one where you wouldn't expect it, but it wouldn't be too ridiculous to implement. Obviously, you can't cook a proximity mine. Obviously, you can't cook an IFG. But maybe you can cook a Plasma Burster, and maybe this would be like, maybe it would affect the trajectory of the burst, because that actually adds some intrigue to the way it works. I mean, I like that. I'm trying to imagine like really specific use cases. I think I sort of established really what they are. I just think it gives you more control. I think maybe there is an argument though for this actually cancelling out how the Plasma Burster is normally affected by your like momentum and trajectory, because then it maybe having them be additive actually removes the point of the overclock, which is to give you more control. Maybe it actually reverts it all the way to a default state. It's only affected by the cooking though. That might be a better option. It's a less fun option, but that might actually hold some weight, I think. If we were ever to get modifications or overclocks for grenades, I think that version of it might be a bit more attractive to Ghost Ship. And obviously, like I said, I'm not going to get into why we don't have those. But as usual, I'm going to try and maybe optimize these for some other kind of implementation. And I think, as I explained it just then, maybe having it also cancel out the usual ways that they're affected by your momentum and trajectory. Yeah, I can see that being a modification. I can see that being a reasonable thing to add in any way. Not to the base Transburster, and that's sort of like the crux in which this all hinges and why this stuff can't really happen, because we don't have it. A lot of these things shouldn't be added to the base grenades, which is why we need to kind of like hypothetically imagine other means of adding these mechanics to the grenades. But yeah, I think this is a cool version of cooking, basically. That's the entire point. What about giving the Plasma Burster a plasma trail? in the form of balanced overclocked, leaving behind a thick plasma trail relative to the burst's trajectory, with decreased maximum damage radius and fear factor. Now this plasma trail, obviously that's a lot more damage you can actually get out of it. It'll be really great against swarmers. Essentially, you create like a line of plasma, like a really thick line of plasma. I put thick plasma trail because like it'll be something a bit more like a tube of persistent plasma almost, right? Because the plasma that's left behind is still sort of like the size of the projectile. If you've ever used roll control on the breach cutter with persistent plasma or with plasma trail, and you just kept it spinning the entire time, it would probably look something like that. I can imagine it being a lot of fun. It would be the kind of one where you probably, like I said, it's relative to the burst trajectory, so it's not like a fixed plasma trail. It's going to be based on the distance between. It's still going to have the same amount of plasma though. The voice crack. It's still going to have the same amount of plasma. So I'd imagine that you'd probably want to actually have it so that space between the bursts is quite high, because then you get the biggest plasma trail possible. I assume because you can't really stack damage. So it's not that you're inherently being punished for having a shorter trail. It's just that I like the idea that it actually does encourage you to use the plasma burster in a certain way, in a way that you might not normally do. You might not normally have it be as spread out as possible. You might actually be, like me, a fan of actually having much denser explosions on the plasma burster. I like doing that. It feels better against larger targets and actually feels better against densely packed hordes. This would encourage doing the opposite. You would actually get a lot more coverage as well, and that bonus damage from the trail wouldn't make it feel like you're wasting by always having a sparsely, wide gapped bursts. So I think it works in that sense. And I like the idea of trails in general for a lot of things. I think more plasma trails would be awesome, or forms of persistent plasma. It doesn't need it now, but plasma bursting missiles is something that I always saw as like maybe giving that some kind of trail would be cool. Obviously the EPC has persistent plasma, although that's not a trail. I do like the idea of something like even the stun sweeper getting a trail. That's not one of the overclocks I made for the stun sweeper though. I like all of these ideas, and I think plasma burster is one that suits it. Because we have the breach cutter and plasma burster, they essentially use the same type of technology in a sense. The plasma burster is sort of like a pseudo explosive breach cutter anyway, so bringing a bit more of that in, pretty cool. Obviously, no form of roll control can exist, and we definitely don't want a plasma burster return to sender. But the next one is probably the closest you could get, because the next one, the unstable, that is plasma softball, you would have seen at the beginning of this video, so you could have read it if you wanted to. And we actually have an increased number of bursts, but it's sort of more like sort of checked by the fact that we actually have plasma burster traveling in a straight line. So you throw it, but it just goes in a straight line quite slowly. We have a limited grenade velocity, like I pointed out, a fixed velocity, even slightly decreased damage and decreased lifetime. It would have to expire at some point, otherwise, if you were in a really wide cave and you just threw it into the ether, it would probably end up going forever or longer than 30 seconds, and I don't think that's quite right. We have an increased number of bursts, but it only bursts on impact of terrain and enemies, and obviously it will bounce away from them relative to where it hit. So we've got like, you imagine the desk and my arm at the top of the cave, bottom of the cave. You might throw it downwards. You might be here and you throw the grenade downwards. It bounces up like that, and that would do a lot to, like, if you had the cave packed of enemies on the ceiling and ground, would have a great effect. It would be even better than a normal plasma burster in really like dense claustrophobic areas. It'd probably be worse in situations like boss fights though. I think it'd be interesting but unstable. This is the kind of idea that can really only exist as an unstable overclock or its own grenade, which I said I wasn't going to explain certain things, but I do want to touch on one thing that they said about grenades somewhat recently, actually, which is the idea that they wouldn't actually do overclocks for grenades because they'd rather just make new grenades. And I appreciate that sentiment. I actually think that's a very good sentiment. But at the same time, I kind of disagree with it in the sense that overclocks would allow them to essentially make things that are functionally new grenades, but without the need to create new grenade models and effects. That's why I actually think grenade overclock is such a good idea. Now, yeah, this could be an interesting grenade of its own kind, especially if it were given to another class. But if you wanted to make something like this and give it to engineer, it doesn't make sense to make a completely new one given the existence of the plasma burster already, which is I'm okay with saying all this because I'm actually making a different point to what I usually do, because basically that's why I think grenade overclock is still a good idea, because they're actually the cheapest way, and I mean that, cheap in the sense that easiest way to make new grenades. Obviously, the strong argument against that is both their idea of just, we could just make new grenades, and also the idea of not wanting to bloat the overclock pool with grenade overclocks. I can imagine most people probably wouldn't be too thrilled about that, which is understandable. Either way, I like this idea a lot. I like the idea of just this fixed thing. I have like an idea of what it. There's something in another game that functions how I imagine this functioning. But obviously, it's just a ball of plasma that travels in a straight line and bounces off surfaces and enemies. And, it will create some crazy patterns and whatnot. It's the kind of thing that'd be really cool if you could somehow pair it with like the trail one. But obviously, we haven't done that. It would be interesting to use in wide environments. It would be really deadly in claustrophobic environments, including to you. Obviously, as an engineer, you can create environment. For example, you can just build platforms like this, and just have it bounce between them. And that would just be a death trap for anything that tries to walk through. That's how you could probably use it against dreadnoughts quite effectively. Maybe even the caretaker if you were a madman. What does this say? Experimental gravity nullifiers result in something that can only be described as a plasma burst in theory, but in practice you may feel differently. It's great. We put more plasma in your plasma. It was deemed a scientific possibility by R&D, but the engineer just kind of did it. Sick. Anyway, those are my plasma burst overclocks. I'm sure the patch notes video is far more interesting, but if you did enjoy this, I do appreciate that, and I'm going to keep doing this every other week until we're done. And then I'm probably going to move on to more overclocks. I do have lots more ideas for gameplay videos, so it's very possible that the overclock workshop might go away once the grenades are done. Probably still going to do Bosco, actually. But yeah, once the grenade overclocks are done, I might just start doing more and more gameplay stuff. Just, just going through individual overclocks and whatnot, or playing individual warnings and things like that. Sort of strange little things, but sort of already have a catalogue of sort of my me playing aspects of the game and my thoughts on them. That might be what this gets replaced by. I think we're going to try and do builds and sort of like even if I have to get to the point where I'm actually just making builds instead of actually showcasing them, the build showcase might end up becoming me making builds on the fly, like taking an overclock and trying to make a build out of it, or taking a weapon, trying to make a build out of it that I normally wouldn't, something like that. Basically, we're not going to run out of content on Tuesday. Don't worry. So yeah, like I said, if you enjoyed, please make sure to like, subscribe. If you're interested in more of these, there will be more of these. So feel free to hit the bell. I mean, I feel so gross saying that. Oh, I feel disgusting. Anyway, that is actually all for today. So thank you for watching once again, and take care.